September 3rd, 1944. Dawn breaks over the dense jungles of New Guinea. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell crouches behind a fallen mahogany tree, her hands trembling as she watches a cluster of enemy soldiers advance through the morning mist. In her grip is a small pineapple-shaped object that will change everything she thought she knew about survival in close combat. What she doesn't realize yet is that the 4 seconds between pulling that pin and the explosion will become the difference between calculated strategy and catastrophic failure, between American tactical superiority and enemy assumptions that would cost thousands of lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had joined the Women's Army Corps in 1942, driven by a fury that burned hotter than patriotism alone could fuel. Her brother, James, had died at Pearl Harbor, incinerated in the USS Arizona before he could even fight back. She had watched her mother collapse at the telegram, watched her father's hands shake as he tried to hold the family together. Sarah had made a promise at James's empty grave that she would make his death mean something. By 1944, that promise had carried her through basic training, through the skepticism of male officers who thought women belonged in typing pools, through transport ships that carried her across an ocean to a war zone most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Now, at 23 years old, she was one of the few women serving in combat support roles in the Southwest Pacific, attached to intelligence units that operated dangerously close to front lines. The morning had started like dozens of others. Sarah's unit, a mixed intelligence and reconnaissance team operating out of a makeshift base near Hollandia, had been tasked with mapping enemy positions in the surrounding jungle. The terrain was brutal, every step a negotiation with mud that sucked at boots, vines that seemed to grab at equipment, insects that carried diseases with names Sarah couldn't pronounce. The heat was oppressive, turning uniforms into soaking rags within minutes. But Sarah had learned to push through discomfort, to focus on the mission, to prove that she belonged in this war as much as any man. Her team had been advancing through a ravine when the ambush came. One moment there was only the sound of their own careful footsteps and the distant calls of tropical birds. The next, gunfire erupted from the ridge above them. Private Rodriguez took a bullet to the shoulder before anyone could react. Sergeant Thompson screamed for everyone to find cover. The world collapsed into chaos, into the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of something heavier, into screams and the smell of gunpowder mixing with the jungle's wet decay. Sarah had thrown herself behind the mahogany tree, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. She could hear Rodriguez groaning, could hear Thompson barking orders that barely cut through the noise. The enemy had the high ground, had them pinned. Standard protocol said to radio for support, to hold position, to wait for reinforcement. But Sarah could see Rodriguez bleeding out, could see the enemy soldiers beginning to flank their position through the jungle. Waiting meant dying. She reached for her belt, fingers closing around the grenades she had been issued but never used in actual combat. The Mark II fragmentation grenade, affectionately called the pineapple by American soldiers for its segmented cast-iron body, had become standard issue in 1918 and remained the primary hand grenade through World War II. Sarah had trained with them at Fort Des Moines, had practiced the mechanics until they were muscle memory. Pull the pin, release the safety lever, throw. The instructors had been clear about the timing: 4 to 5 seconds from lever release to detonation, 4 to 5 seconds to make sure it exploded near the enemy, not in your hand. What Sarah didn't know, what most American soldiers in the Pacific didn't fully understand yet, was that enemy forces had developed assumptions about American grenades based on their own equipment. Japanese Type 97 grenades required a deliberate strike against a hard surface to activate the fuse, then had a 7 to 8 second delay. German stick grenades had similar longer delays. The enemy had come to expect time after a grenade was thrown, time to pick it up and hurl it back, time to dive for cover and potentially survive. They had no experience with the American 4-second fuse, no understanding that American grenades were designed to explode almost immediately upon landing, giving defenders no chance to react. Sarah pulled the pin on her first grenade, her training taking over, even as her mind screamed with fear. The safety lever flew free with a metallic ping that seemed impossibly loud. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. She forced herself to count, forced herself to hold it for that crucial extra second that would prevent anyone from throwing it back. 3 Mississippi. She hurled it over the log toward the cluster of enemy soldiers she had seen moving through the underbrush to their left.
The grenade arced through the humid air, spinning end over end. Sarah pressed herself flat against the mud, hands over her ears. The explosion came exactly when her training said it would, a sharp crack followed by the whine of shrapnel cutting through vegetation. She heard screaming, heard the distinct change in enemy fire patterns, heard Thompson yelling something she couldn't quite make out. She was already reaching for her second grenade. What Sarah witnessed in those next few seconds would later be documented by military intelligence as a critical tactical advantage that American forces exploited throughout the Pacific Campaign. An enemy soldier, seeing her second grenade land near his position, did exactly what his training and experience had taught him. He dove for it, intending to throw it back at the Americans. His hands actually closed around the ridged metal surface. Then it exploded, the 4-second fuse leaving him no time to react, no time to understand his mistake. The blast killed him instantly and wounded 2 others who had assumed they had time to scatter. Sarah threw 4 grenades in rapid succession, each one carefully timed, each one aimed at the positions where she could see muzzle flashes. The enemy fire began to falter. She could hear confusion in the shouts echoing through the jungle, could sense the moment when coordinated attack collapsed into panicked retreat. Thompson seized the advantage, leading a counterattack that drove the remaining enemy soldiers back into the dense jungle. Within minutes, the ambush had been broken. Rodriguez was still alive, moaning but breathing. They had survived. In the aftermath, as medics worked on Rodriguez and the team secured the perimeter, Sarah sat with her back against a mahogany tree and tried to stop shaking. Her hands were covered in mud and scratches from the rough bark. Her uniform was soaked through with sweat and rainwater and possibly Rodriguez's blood. She felt hollowed out, like something essential had been carved from her chest. She had just killed people. The intellectual understanding of war, the abstract knowledge that combat meant ending lives, had crashed into visceral reality. Those were human beings she had blown apart with her grenades. They had families, histories, dreams that would never be fulfilled. Sergeant Thompson dropped down beside her, his weathered face creased with something that might have been respect. "Good work, Mitchell," he said quietly. "You saved Rodriguez. Probably saved all of us." Sarah nodded but couldn't find words. Thompson seemed to understand. He had been in combat since Guadalcanal, had that 1,000-yard stare that veterans carried. "First time's always the hardest," he said. "You did what you had to do. Remember that." What neither Sarah nor Thompson understood yet was that this small skirmish, this desperate defense in an unnamed ravine, was part of a larger pattern that military intelligence was beginning to recognize across the Pacific theater. American grenades, with their shorter fuses and different detonation mechanisms, were creating tactical situations where enemy soldiers' own training worked against them. Reports were coming in from dozens of engagements where enemy forces had attempted to throw back American grenades, only to have them explode in their hands or immediately after they touched them. The 4-second delay that American soldiers took for granted was proving catastrophically shorter than what enemy forces expected. The intelligence report that eventually made its way up the chain of command originated with observations from Sarah's unit and dozens of others operating across New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. Captain Robert Henderson, an intelligence officer attached to General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command, began compiling these reports in late 1944. What he discovered was a systematic tactical advantage that American forces had been exploiting, often without realizing it. Henderson's analysis revealed that enemy tactical doctrine, developed from years of conflict in Asia and influenced by European practices, assumed grenades had delays of 6 to 8 seconds from activation to detonation. This assumption was built into their training, their reflexes, their instant responses in combat. Japanese infantry manuals specifically instructed soldiers that if an enemy grenade landed nearby, they had sufficient time to either throw it back or move to minimum safe distance. German training was similar, based on the stick grenade's 5 to 7 second fuse. The American Mark II grenade, with its 4 to 5 second fuse, violated these assumptions in ways that created deadly surprises. But the advantage went deeper than just shorter timing. The Mark II's design, with its segmented cast iron body, created a fragmentation pattern that was devastatingly effective at close range. When enemy soldiers dove toward American grenades intending to throw them back, they were moving directly into the kill radius rather than away from it. The tactical doctrine that should have protected them, instead, guaranteed their deaths.
Sarah learned these details weeks later, during a briefing where Henderson himself presented his findings to combat units. The captain was a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses that seemed perpetually fogged in the jungle humidity, but his analysis was sharp and thorough. He showed them captured enemy training manuals, demonstrated the timing differences with dummy grenades, explained how what seemed like small technical variations translated into combat advantages. "Your grenades are weapons the enemy doesn't fully understand," Henderson told them. "They expect time they don't have. Use that." The briefing changed something in how Sarah understood her role in the war. She had joined to honor her brother, to strike back at the forces that had killed him, but combat was more complex than revenge fantasies. It was about small technical advantages, about understanding enemy assumptions, about exploiting gaps in their knowledge and training. The grenades weren't just explosive devices, they were psychological weapons that turned enemy training against them, that created hesitation and fear, that made every thrown American grenade a potential trap. As September turned into October and then November, Sarah's unit pushed deeper into enemy-held territory. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat in jungles where visibility measured in yards rather than miles. She threw grenades in dozens of engagements, each time feeling that same hollow sickness afterward, each time wondering if she was becoming numb to killing. But she also saw the pattern Henderson had described. She saw enemy soldiers hesitate when grenades landed, saw them reach for the explosives as if they had time, saw the confusion and terror when those assumptions proved false. Private First Class Maria Gonzalez, who had joined Sarah's unit in October, provided another perspective on the grenade advantage. Maria had grown up in Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrants who had fled violence in Mexico. She spoke fluent Spanish and passable Japanese, skills that made her invaluable for interrogating prisoners. Through her translations, Sarah learned what enemy soldiers were saying about American grenades. They called them instant death in one captured diary. Another prisoner, a sergeant who had survived 3 years of fighting, admitted through Maria's translation that his men had stopped trying to throw back American grenades after losing too many soldiers. "We learned to just run," he said. "There is no time for anything else." The psychological impact of the grenade timing extended beyond individual engagements. As word spread through enemy ranks that American grenades couldn't be safely thrown back, it created a cascading effect on their tactical doctrine. Enemy forces began maintaining greater distances during combat, became more reluctant to close with American positions, developed a fear of close-quarters fighting where grenades were most effective. The small technical difference in fuse timing was reshaping how entire battles were fought. But the advantage came with costs that haunted Sarah through sleepless nights. Every grenade she threw represented human lives ended, enemy soldiers who were following their training, doing their duty, dying because of assumptions they didn't even know they were making. She tried to rationalize it as Henderson did, as necessary tactical advantage in a brutal war. She tried to focus on the American lives saved, on Rodriguez recovering from his wounds, on missions accomplished and territory secured. But late at night, in her tent with rain hammering on canvas, she couldn't escape the images of bodies torn apart by her grenades, couldn't unhear the screams that echoed through jungle valleys. Sergeant Thompson, who had taken Sarah under his wing, offered what wisdom his 3 years of combat had taught him. "You can't carry the weight of every life you take," he told her one night as they shared coffee made from questionable grounds. "You'll break if you try. You do your job, you keep your people alive, you trust that the cause is worth the cost. That's all any of us can do." Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to find that mental separation between duty and conscience, but she was beginning to understand that some weights couldn't be set down, that some costs accumulated regardless of justification. December 1944, the war in the Pacific had evolved into something uglier than anyone had predicted back in 1941. Sarah Mitchell found herself stationed at a forward operating base on Leyte, part of the massive American push to retake the Philippines. The base was a collection of tents and hastily constructed buildings carved out of jungle that seemed determined to reclaim every inch of cleared ground. Rain fell almost constantly, turning pathways into rivers of mud, making every movement an exhausting slog through sucking earth. Sarah had been promoted to first lieutenant, a recognition of her combat experience and her role in several successful reconnaissance missions. But the promotion felt hollow. She commanded a small intelligence unit now, responsible not just for her own survival, but for leading others into danger. The weight of that responsibility sat on her shoulders like a physical thing, pressing, making it hard to breathe some nights. Her unit's current assignment involved coordinating with infantry companies pushing into enemy-held villages in the Central Highlands. The terrain was mountainous, covered in dense vegetation that made visibility nearly impossible beyond a few yards.
Enemy forces had fortified villages with intricate tunnel systems and hidden bunkers, turning every structure into a potential death trap. Grenades had become the primary weapon for clearing these fortifications, thrown into bunkers and tunnels where rifles were useless. Captain Elena Vasquez, who commanded the infantry company Sarah's unit supported, was a hard woman with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much death. She had fought through North Africa and Sicily before being transferred to the Pacific, and she ran her company with the efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation killed soldiers. Sarah respected her immensely, even feared her a little. Vasquez had a way of cutting through pretense and doubt, of forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the war they were fighting. During a mission briefing in mid-December, Vasquez addressed the assembled officers about grenade tactics. "I've been reviewing after-action reports from the past 3 months," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of rain hammering on the tent roof. "We've got a consistent pattern. Enemy forces are still trying to throw back our grenades in close-quarter situations. They're losing soldiers to this mistake at rates that should have forced a doctrine change months ago, but they're not adapting. Anyone know why?" Sarah raised her hand, drawing on Henderson's intelligence briefings and her own combat experience. "Their training is too rigid," she said. "They're conditioned to respond automatically. The reflex to throw back grenades is drilled into them until it's instinctive. Even when soldiers survive encounters with our grenades and understand the danger, they can't overcome that training in the moment." Vasquez nodded approvingly. "Exactly right, Mitchell, which means we need to exploit this systematically. I want every squad carrying maximum grenade loads on clearing operations. We're going to use their training against them, turn their reflexes into a weapon we control." The briefing continued with tactical details, but Sarah found her mind drifting to the implications of what they were discussing. They were deliberately exploiting a flaw in enemy training, using soldiers' conditioned responses to kill them. It was brilliant strategy. It was also deeply disturbing. The operation launched on December 18th, targeting a village called San Rafael that intelligence indicated housed a major enemy command post. Sarah's unit moved with Vasquez's infantry company, her role to coordinate intelligence gathering and interrogate any prisoners taken. The approach march took 6 hours through terrain so steep and muddy that soldiers had to pull each other up slopes, through vegetation so thick that machetes were necessary every few yards. The village appeared suddenly through the jungle, a cluster of wooden structures built into the hillside with terraced rice paddies surrounding them. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, except for the complete absence of civilians. Every resident had either fled or been evacuated by enemy forces who had converted the village into a fortress. Vasquez deployed her company in a semicircle around the village, then gave the order to advance. The fighting started immediately. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions, forcing the infantry to ground. Mortars began dropping shells with terrifying accuracy, suggesting forward observers hidden somewhere in the surrounding jungle. Sarah found herself pressed flat against muddy earth behind a rice paddy wall, her radio operator, Private Chen, beside her, trying to coordinate fire support while bullets cracked overhead. Vasquez's voice came over the radio, calm despite the chaos. All squads, grenades on prepared positions, execute. Sarah watched as American soldiers began systematically throwing grenades at every structure, every suspicious mound of earth, every potential firing position. The distinctive crack of Mark II grenades echoed across the village in rapid succession, each explosion followed by screams or silence. What happened next validated everything Henderson's intelligence had predicted. Enemy soldiers defending bunkers and fortified buildings responded to the grenade assault exactly as their training dictated. They grabbed thrown grenades and attempted to throw them back, but the 4-second fuses left them no time. Explosions came in their hands, inside their defensive positions, killing them in the act of what should have been effective defensive tactics. Sarah watched one enemy soldier through binoculars, watched him see a grenade land in his bunker entrance, watched him dive for it with what looked like practiced precision. The grenade detonated before his hands fully closed around it, the blast killing him and collapsing part of the bunker. It was exactly what Vasquez had predicted, exactly what Henderson's intelligence had documented. It was also profoundly tragic, watching a soldier die because his training had become his death sentence. The village fell within 2 hours, a remarkably short time for such fortified position. American casualties were lighter than expected.
Casualties. Devastating. As medics treated wounded and engineers began searching captured positions, Sarah conducted her intelligence work, examining documents and questioning the handful of prisoners who had survived. Through Private Chen's translation, she learned what she already suspected. The prisoners knew about American grenade timing, had been warned by survivors of other battles, but knowing intellectually and overcoming trained reflexes were entirely different things. One prisoner, a corporal who had lost his left hand to a grenade explosion, spoke to Sarah with something like resignation. Chen translated his words carefully. "We know your grenades explode faster. We know not to touch them. But when it lands beside you, your body moves before your mind can stop it. The training is too deep. We are killed by our own discipline." That statement haunted Sarah for days afterward. The enemy soldiers weren't dying because they were stupid or poorly trained. They were dying because they were too well trained, because their discipline was so ingrained that it overrode survival instincts. The American grenade advantage wasn't just technical, it was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind, turning soldiers' dedication and training into fatal vulnerabilities. By January 1945, Sarah had been in combat for over 6 months. She had thrown more grenades than she could count, had watched the pattern repeat itself dozens of times, enemy soldiers reaching for American grenades, dying in the act. She had killed directly with her own grenades and coordinated attacks that killed hundreds more. The numbers had become abstract, a necessary defense against the weight of what she was doing. But in quiet moments, the abstraction fell away, and she was left with the reality of lives ended, of human beings reduced to casualties in after-action reports. Private Maria Gonzalez, who had become Sarah's closest friend in the unit, noticed the toll the war was taking. Maria was younger, only 20, with an optimism that seemed impossible to maintain in the jungle's brutality. But she possessed an emotional intelligence that helped her see past Sarah's professional facade. One night, sharing a tent while rain drummed overhead, Maria asked the question Sarah had been avoiding. How do you keep doing this? How do you throw those grenades knowing what's going to happen? Sarah didn't have a good answer. She talked about duty, about honoring her brother's memory, about the necessity of defeating an enemy that had started this war with aggression and atrocity. But even as she spoke the words, they felt inadequate. The real answer was darker and more complex. She kept doing it because stopping meant letting down the soldiers who depended on her, because questioning the mission in the middle of combat got people killed, because once you started down the path of war, turning back required a kind of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Maria listened without judgment, then shared her own struggles. "My family didn't want me to join," she said quietly. "They thought I was betraying my heritage by fighting for a country that put Japanese Americans in camps, that treats Mexicans like second-class citizens. But I believed in something bigger than the country's flaws. I believed we were fighting genuine evil. Now I'm not sure what we're fighting. We're just trying to survive, trying to kill them before they kill us. When did it become just that?" The question had no satisfactory answer, but the conversation helped Sarah feel less alone in her doubts. War stripped away idealism, revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and national causes. They were fighting because they were here, because going home required getting through this hell first, because stopping meant dishonoring the sacrifices already made. The circular logic trapped them as surely as the war itself. February brought new assignments, new villages to clear, new soldiers to lead into combat. Sarah's unit participated in the assault on Manila, the devastating urban warfare that reduced the Philippine capital to rubble and killed over 100,000 civilians. The grenade advantage continued to provide tactical benefits, but the cost in human suffering became impossible to ignore. Sarah saw things in Manila that broke something fundamental in her understanding of warfare's morality. She saw civilian casualties that exceeded military ones, saw cities destroyed to save them, saw the line between combatant and non-combatant blur until it disappeared entirely. Sergeant First Class David Park, a Korean-American soldier who had joined her unit in January, provided another perspective that challenged Sarah's assumptions. David had grown up in Los Angeles, had been targeted by both racial prejudice and by association with Japanese Americans during the internment hysteria. He fought with a fury that came from having to prove his loyalty constantly, from being seen as enemy because of his face, despite being born in California. "I throw those grenades without hesitation," he told Sarah during a rare moment of candor, "because every explosion proves I'm American, proves my loyalty. I can't afford doubt. Doubt gets me sent to a camp like the Japanese families I grew up with."
David's words revealed how the war exploited not just enemy training, but American soldiers' own vulnerabilities. Men like David fought harder to prove they belonged. Women like Sarah and Maria fought to prove they were capable. Every group had something to prove, some reason to push through horror that should have broken them. The war machinery ran on this personal motivations, on fear and ambition, and the need to belong to something larger than individual doubt. By March, Sarah had been recommended for a Bronze Star for her actions during the Manila campaign. The awards ceremony felt surreal, standing in clean uniform before officers who talked about valor and sacrifice while bodies still lay rotting in Manila's ruins. She accepted the medal because refusing would insult the soldiers who had fought beside her, but she felt like a fraud. Valor suggested choice, nobility, moral clarity. What she had done was survive, kill when necessary, follow orders that sometimes made her sick. That wasn't valor. That was just war. Captain Vasquez, present at the ceremony, pulled Sarah aside afterward. "You think you don't deserve this," Vasquez said bluntly. "You think the killing makes you unworthy. But leadership isn't about feeling good about hard decisions. It's about making them anyway. About carrying the weight so your soldiers don't have to. You've done that. The medal recognizes it." Sarah wanted to believe Vasquez, wanted to accept that moral leadership could coexist with the brutality she had participated in. But she kept thinking about enemy soldiers dying because of their own training, about the corporal who lost his hand, about the countless others who had reached for American grenades in fatal reflex. They had been brave too, disciplined too. What made her medal honorable and their deaths just casualties? The war in the Pacific was grinding toward its conclusion by April 1945. Allied forces controlled the Philippines, had taken Iwo Jima at horrific cost, were preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. Sarah's unit was slated for that operation, would be part of the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The grenade tactics would be crucial in the cave-to-cave fighting that intelligence predicted. Sarah would throw more grenades, exploit the 4-second advantage dozens more times, add to the casualty counts that would eventually force surrender. But something had changed in how she understood her role. She wasn't fighting for vengeance anymore, wasn't trying to honor her brother's memory through enemy deaths. She was fighting because these soldiers beside her had become her family, because their survival mattered more than abstract causes or national rhetoric. Private Chen with his terrible jokes, Maria with her impossible optimism, David Park proving his belonging with every action, Sergeant Thompson who had taught her how to survive. These people were worth the moral cost, worth the weight of what she carried. The last weeks before Okinawa, Sarah spent time training new replacements in grenade tactics. She taught them the mechanics, the timing, the tactical applications. But she also tried to prepare them for the psychological cost, for what it meant to exploit enemy training, to kill soldiers who were brave and disciplined and following orders. Some listened. Others thought she was overthinking combat. Maybe she was. But if even one soldier understood the weight before they had to carry it, maybe that justified the conversation. On April 1st, 1945, Sarah stood on a transport ship approaching Okinawan's beaches, grenades clipped to her belt, ready to employ the 4-second advantage once more. She wasn't naive anymore about what war demanded or what victory would cost. She understood that the grenade tactics were both brilliant strategy and moral compromise, that winning required exploiting enemy weaknesses, even when those weaknesses came from their own discipline and courage. She understood that she would carry the weight of every life she took for the rest of her existence, that some costs couldn't be justified or rationalized away. But she also understood that love could exist alongside horror, that fighting for the soldiers beside her was enough reason to keep going. That maybe redemption wasn't about feeling good, but about acknowledging the cost and choosing to carry it anyway. The landing craft lowered its ramp onto Okinawan sand. Sarah led her unit forward into another battle, another opportunity to prove herself, another weight to carry. She did it because these soldiers deserved a leader who understood what was being asked of them, who wouldn't minimize the cost, who would fight beside them despite knowing exactly what it meant. The 4 seconds between pulling a grenade pin and explosion still represented the difference between tactical advantage and enemy assumptions. But they also represented the space where choice lived, where Sarah decided again and again to carry the moral weight so her soldiers might survive to go home. That wasn't valor, in any noble sense, but it was love. Fierce and uncompromising, worth fighting for even when the cause became unclear and the costs impossible to justify.